Hello YouTube world, Pretend Farmer here. Not a real farmer, just pretending. You know, fall is right around the corner, and as summer comes to an end, people oftentimes will stay out late in the evenings, sharing stories, spending time with friends, trying to enjoy the outdoors as much as possible before the weather gets really cold. Now during those times, you might be out in your shorts and t-shirts during the day, but you get those chilly nights. It's a very handy skill to be able to build a fire if you're out somewhere where you can legally do so. To anybody that burns down a commercial building, I did not tell you to light that thing on fire. But if you're outside, maybe you're on the beach or in the woods, camping, whatever, you can be the cool kid if you know how to build a fire and do it without any kind of fire starter, because that's cheating. Pretend Farmer is going to show you just 3 easy steps to build your own fire. This applies to whether you're camping or whether you're trying to light up a wood stove for the first time. Do what I show you here and you'll have that thing roaring in no time at all. Let's get into it. If you're building a fire outside, you really need to have a good trench or a good dirt berm, someplace that's actually safe to build a fire where you're not going to burn anything down. So make sure of that. If you're using a wood stove, just make sure you're building the fire in the stove and you're good. So we're going to make our fire right there, and I want you to think of this as just 3 easy steps. A lot of people think you start building a fire with kindling. That's false. Before you ever get to that stage, you are going to use tinder to light your fire off. Now for lighting your fire using tinder, I want you to think of smallest of small. Pine needles, little sticks, pine cones, tiny little twigs, the smallest of the small stuff that's going to easily light when a match hits it. We're going to get the fire going with this, and I'm here to tell you that pine needles will burn just as good as gasoline, trust me. But once we light these off, get this stuff going, that's when you break out your little pieces of tree bark. If you find good dry tree bark, that stuff's going to light up and go off real quick. First you use tinder, then you progress into your kindling, which is basically bark. From there, you will progress into adding smaller sticks of wood. Not great big logs, but just really small, thin pieces on top of your already burning bark. Let's see if we can make it happen. You're going to start out by throwing your tinder in the middle of your fire pit or your fireplace. You don't want to pack it down really tight or anything. It's actually better to have it a little loose so that air can get in there. From there, I'm going to take my little twigs and stuff and kind of lay them on top of there in such a way that the fire can burn up through them, but yet they don't smother it out. Now, personally, I like using matches, but the Pretend Farmer ended up being all out of matches. So we used the good old-fashioned grill lighter, but there are many different ways to ignite a fire. As long as you've got some sort of ignition source, I'm telling you, those pine needles will really take off if they get a spark. Now at this point we have more than enough fuel, but that flame is struggling for oxygen. So we're just going to kind of blow and fan it, try and give it some air and let it consume some of that fuel before we add any more. Throwing on large handfuls of pine needles at this point would just smother the fire out. I'm sprinkling lightly whenever I do add anything, and you can see the fire is really starting to work its way around and burn up all that tinder. So I decided to go ahead and start throwing on some thin little pieces of bark before it went out. This is kind of taking it into the next stage. As you can see, once that bark starts to take off, it's really going to burn and sustain a lot better. So at this point, we've put our tinder in there, set it off. Once we got that burning good, we started progressing into some of our really thin bark, getting on up into the kindling stage. Once we built up to having bigger pieces of bark that were burning and we had a pretty solid, healthy looking flame, we went ahead and carefully put some firewood on top, small pieces. It's important to remember that a fire just needs 3 things to burn. You need an ignition source to get it started, then you need oxygen and fuel to sustain it. That oxygen and fuel has to be a careful ratio. In this case, our fuel is wood. The oxygen is everywhere, man. There's a careful balance that has to be weighed out between your oxygen and fuel to keep a fire going. And this is usually where people go wrong. You don't want to throw on too many big pieces of wood before that fire is really taken off. Otherwise, you're overloading it with fuel more so than the oxygen. At that point, it can't get enough oxygen because you've covered it up and smothered it with your fuel. And your fuel's not going to take off because the oxygen isn't enough to actually ignite it. That's why it's important as you progress through each stage, whether it be going from the tinder to the kindling, or whether it be going from that to your smaller pieces of wood, until you build up to that full-blown self-sustaining fire. You need to make sure that you're giving each phase time to get enough oxygen and to really start burning that wood good before you add more pieces on. And even then, you want to make sure that you're not dumping too much on that's going to cover it up, smother it out. Well, it'll take about a half an hour or so. But what's going to happen as your wood burns down and you add more is you're going to develop a bed of coals. At that point, your fire is what I consider to be self-sustaining. It's very stable. You're going to have a hard time messing up at that point. And from there, you can go ahead, you can pile on the big logs, and they're all going to take off and burn from there. Even if they're a little wet, they'll still burn. They will dry out. It'll take them longer. It's not ideal, but they'll turn black and eventually get hot enough and dry out enough that they will combust and catch and start to burn. We're at the point now where we can go ahead and just start throwing our big pieces of regular size wood on this thing. Look at that thing roaring, man. This has all taken the place over about 10 minutes. It doesn't take long to really get a good fire going if you know what you're doing. And the best part is, we didn't have to dump half a can of fuel on there to get this thing to light and stay burning. Not only is that dangerous, but in most places it's not even legal to use an accelerant like that to start a fire. Knowing how to build a fire the right way like this is a good skill for anybody to know. You know, it's actually a little warm out today to build a fire, but the chickens love to use the ashes in this fire pit as a dust bath, so it benefits their health, and I like to try and keep some in there at all times. The fact is, summertime is just about winding down to an end. School is starting back just about everywhere you go, and before we know it, the leaves will be changing colors. You're going to be sitting out somewhere in the wilderness with your friends at a campsite. They're going to say, man, it's chilly. Who wants to build a fire? You can say, I know how, let me get it. Either that or maybe you buy a farmhouse and decide you're not going to be a pretend farmer, you're going to be a real farmer. Well, if you got a potbelly stove, you follow these same steps and you can build a fire in it and keep your house warm too. There's just something relaxing about a fire. I don't know what it is. Y'all stay warm out there, and until next time, this is the Pretend Farmer signing out.